The snow had fallen heavier than usual that morning. Thick and silent, it blanketed the ridge above the timberline, where no one but elk and memory roamed. Mark stirred the embers of his morning fire, the scent of pine, smoke, and boiled coffee, filling the single-room cabin he'd built with his own hands 15 winters ago. His world was quiet, chosen, distant from the noise men made when they forgot how to be good. He heard it first, an unnatural crack echoing through the pines. Then came the smell. Burnt iron, scorched wood. Something beyond the ridge. He stood, still, rifle in hand, the steam of his breath trailing into the cold light. By the time he reached the wreck, the wagon was nothing but splintered beams and ash, its wheels canted like snapped bones. A horse, long gone. A trail of blood in the snow, half covered by wind. Then he saw them. A woman lay twisted at the base of a pine, one arm bent wrong, her braid tangled with snow and dirt. Her dress, blue once, was torn near the shoulder, blood seeping into the fabric like ink on parchment. She looked young, but life had stolen that softness from her face. Her lips were cracked, her skin already pale from the cold. Mark kneeled beside her, 2 fingers to her neck. Faint pulse. Barely. The whisper came from the snow. He turned sharply, rifle lowered again. A little girl stood a few feet away, her cheeks red with cold, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Barely more than 5. She looked up at him with a strange steadiness. Her voice broke when she spoke. "Don't let her die, she's pretty." Mark stared at her. No tears, just that plea. Her small hand held out a paper, wet at the corners. He took it. The words were faded, but he read them aloud in his mind. If found, please protect her. No name, no reason, just that. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He bent down and lifted the woman into his arms, careful with the broken wrist. The girl followed without being told, her boots crunching the snow. They reached the cabin just before dark. The storm would fall hard tonight. He could smell it in the wind, in the way the crows had gone quiet. Inside, he laid the woman near the fire on the bearskin rug, wrapped her in his only spare quilt, and lit the oil lamp. She didn't stir. The girl stood in the corner, still watching. Her eyes were dark as river stones. Mark poured a cup of warm broth and held it out to her. She took it silently. Her fingers were shaking. He cleaned the woman's cuts, splinted her wrist with 2 slender birch branches, and covered her with another quilt. Her body trembled once, then stilled. As he worked, he noticed the girl sitting closer now, her legs tucked beneath her, watching him with that same unreadable expression. When he sat back, the fire crackled softly. His cabin smelled of old wood and wet fabric, of blood and boiled herbs. The silence returned, thick and heavy. The girl scooted toward him and laid down beside the woman, her hand slipping into his. Her tiny fingers curled around his calloused thumb. Mark didn't move. Outside, the wind began to rise. He stared into the fire, its orange light flickering across the woman's face. There was a scar beneath her chin, old and silver. Her lips parted in a breath, but she didn't wake. He didn't know if she'd live. But for tonight, she was warm, and for now, that was enough. It took 3 days for the woman to open her eyes. Mark had kept her fed in sips, lifting a spoon to her lips when she stirred, keeping her warm with thick quilts and the steady burn of split pine in the hearth. The little girl, Nia, had stopped asking questions after the first night. Instead, she sat close, always watching her mother's face, small fingers brushing loose strands of dark hair back from her brow. When the woman finally stirred and blinked into the glow of firelight, she didn't speak. Her gaze moved around the room, finding the wooden walls, the kettle on the stove, the child asleep beside her. Then she looked at Mark, who sat in the corner, mending a boot's sole by lamplight. He met her eyes, nodded once, and went back to his work. No words passed, but something settled. He left tea on the table for her the next morning and returned to his chores without waiting. It took her nearly an hour to sit up and reach it. She didn't drink much, but she drank. Each day, she moved a little more. Still, no name. Still no speech. But Mark had seen that kind of silence before. War left it behind. So did men who used their fists instead of their words. He remembered her eyes from that night in the snow, wide, alert, not asking for help, but daring him to walk away. He hadn't. Not then. Not now. By the 4th day, she whispered something. under her breath in Lakota as she brushed out her braid. Mark didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said in her tongue, "You're safe here." She froze, staring at him. He didn't look up from the carving knife in his hand. He hadn't spoken Lakota in years. Not since the fire, not since that village. One he'd scouted ahead of, only to return and find it ash. His own men, drunk, with power and fear. They'd laughed as they torched homes and shot children who ran. Mark had turned his gun on one of them, left the rest, rode into the mountains and never came back down. Now he carved spoons and rabbits, traded pelts once a month, and spoke to no one. That night, the girl curled up by the hearth while Mark stirred the stew. The woman, still silent, placed a log on the fire. Her fingers were healing, her wrists still wrapped tight in birch and cloth. When Mark pulled off his coat by the fire, she saw the old scars on his back, slashing white ridges, some deep, some faded. A bullet wound above his ribs. Her eyes lingered, but she said nothing. Later, while Nia played with a rope of twine near the rocker, Mark handed her a small carved rabbit with big ears and a crooked smile. She turned it over in her hand, then held it up to the firelight. "For me?" she asked. He nodded. She stared at him a moment longer, her small voice breaking the still. "You're not as scary as you look, Bear." Mark blinked. "Bear?" he asked. She giggled and pointed at his beard. "You look like one, but nicer." The woman smiled then. Just a little. Not forced, not polite. Real. Like something deep inside had exhaled. That night, as the fire crackled low, the room was quiet, but no longer heavy. The cabin had stopped being a hiding place. It had started becoming something else. The storm came like a judgment. Low clouds pressing down over the valley, wind howling through the pines like wolves in mourning. By midday, snow fell in sheets, the kind that silenced everything except the roar of the wind. Inside the cabin, Mark stacked the last of the chopped wood beside the stove. His breath was visible even indoors now, and he said nothing as he pulled on his coat and stepped back out into the storm with his axe. Each swing was met with resistance, wet pine cracking, like old bone. His arms ached. The cold bit through his gloves, but he didn't stop. Inside, Waya worked in silence, mending the tear in his old coat. Her fingers had grown stronger again. The girl slept wrapped in a shawl, her rabbit clutched tight. Every few moments, Waya would glance at the window, where snow collected like time. Fast, unrelenting. By the second night, food was low. Meat, rationed. The stew had more broth than bite. Mark didn't complain, just chewed slow and swallowed hard. When the coughing started, it was sudden. The girl gasped awake, eyes wide, clutching her chest. Waya was at her side instantly, her hand on the girl's forehead. "Fever." Mark was already boiling water. "Cedar," he said, opening a tin. "And willow bark." Waya nodded, her hands steady as she crushed herbs between her palms. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same cloth. They paused. Her breath was shallow. His hand lingered. A second too long. She didn't pull away, he didn't speak. When the girl finally drifted back to sleep, sweat on her brow and medicine on her lips, the fire burned low, casting soft gold over their worn faces. Outside, the wind screamed against the window. The next day, a shadow appeared beyond the tree line. Mark was skinning a rabbit when he froze. He felt it before he saw it. Movement where there should have been stillness. He reached for his rifle and stepped outside. A rider. The figure was distant but too deliberate to be chance. The man wore a heavy coat, his horse twitching beneath him, snow rising to its belly. He held a paper, waving it slowly like a signal. Waya came to the window. Her breath caught. Mark stepped forward, disappearing into the pines. For a long while, only the snow moved. When he returned, dusk was falling. "He won't come back," Mark said, brushing snow from his coat. No blood, no answer, just those words. Waya said nothing, but her eyes followed him as he placed the rifle back by the door. That night, he found her outside. She stood barefoot in the snow, wrapped in a thin shawl, facing the trees. Her hair had come loose in the wind, long and dark, flowing behind her like smoke. She whispered something into the storm, words he half understood. He walked to her, slow, quiet, eye in her hand. She held a long braid of her own hair, the gift, the Lakota promise of survival, of trust, of gratitude. She held it out. Mark looked at it, his breath trembling in the cold that he didn't take it. Instead, he bowed his head. Not rejection. Not yet acceptance. Respect. She lowered her hand and looked away, eyes shining in the wind. They stood like that for a long time, the snow falling between them, saying all the things they hadn't spoken yet. The first signs of spring were small and slow. Wet earth beneath the snow, pine needles returning their scent, the faint sound of meltwater running under ice. The wind no longer howled. It whispered. Inside the cabin, days passed in rhythm. Mark chopped wood. Waya boiled roots and herbs. The girl, Nia, began to laugh again, soft bursts of sound like birds returning. She chased the chickens Mark kept pinned out back, arms flapping, cheeks full of color. When she wasn't outside, she sat near her mother, carefully braiding strands of her long hair, tongue between her teeth as she worked. But the quiet in the cabin wasn't peace, it was practiced distance. Mark and Waya moved around each other like dancers who didn't know the steps. She folded his shirts. He left her extra venison on her plate. They spoke only when needed, and their words were brief. No arguments, no sharpness, but also no warmth. Something unspoken lived between them, something raw and unfinished. Mark kept his rifle close, even when he sat. It leaned beside his chair like a shadow he couldn't shake. Waya watched it sometimes, her gaze unreadable at night. She still jerked awake, gasping, reaching for a child already safe. Mark never looked at her when it happened, but he always added another log to the fire afterward. One evening, she tried to help. She reached for the kettle to add dried onion, speaking for the first time in days. "I can cook, you know," she said, her voice soft. Mark turned. He didn't mean to. His hand shot out too fast, catching her wrist before he thought. Her whole body tensed. Not from pain, from memory. He let go immediately. Her eyes didn't blink that he stepped back. Then he left, the door shut behind him like thunder. Waya stood still, the kettle in her hand, her breath loud in the quiet. Nia sat on the floor nearby, holding her rabbit, confused but silent. Mark didn't come back for hours. When he did, the moon was high. His hands were red from cold. His coat was wet. He didn't speak that he walked to the table and placed something down. A pendant. Waya stared at it. It was hers, silver, cracked at the edge, a bird carved in the center. She'd lost it by the creek days ago. She hadn't even mentioned it. He didn't say where he'd found it. Just walked past the fire, and Saturday Waya picked it up, turning it over once. The silence stretched long again, but this time it wasn't empty. "You saved me," she said softly. "But you don't think you deserve saving." Mark didn't look at her, but he didn't leave. The kettle hissed over the fire. Outside, the wind had gone still. Inside, Nia slept curled between them, her head on a folded coat. Mark reached over and added a log to the fire. It caught slowly, then glowed. Waya sat down across from him. No words came after that, but something shifted in the room, like spring thawing a mountain one drop at a time. The air had changed. Spring had arrived in full. The trees blooming in soft bursts, the snow receding into the hills like a memory too stubborn to fade. The cabin felt different now, not just warmer, but lived in. The girl, Nia, sang to the chickens and named them all after stars. Waya cooked without waiting for permission, and Mark, without saying a word, had begun leaving her favorite mug by the fire each morning. Filled with warm water and pine honey, he taught Nia to fish with a carved stick and a quiet patience. She laughed when he slipped on the river rocks, and he didn't scold her, just smiled, faint and fleeting. Waya watched them from the bank, her shawl wrapped loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft. In the evenings, they all sat together, sometimes silent, sometimes telling stories in half sentences. Mark carved. Waya mended. Nia braided pine needles into little wreaths. No one named what was happening between them, but it was there. Familiarity without fear. Movement without flinching. One golden afternoon, Waya found him sitting in the tall grass behind the cabin, near the old cottonwood. Across his lap lay a bundle of aged cloth, pale and delicate, a wedding dress. He didn't notice her at first, just stared at the fabric, running his calloused thumb along the worn lace. When he finally looked up, his face was older than usual. "She made it herself," he said, voice gravel low. "Didn't even get to wear it." Waya didn't speak. She sat beside him in the grass. He kept going. We married with prayers and promises. Then she got sick. Too much blood. The baby didn't make it either. He glanced toward the cottonwood. There, he said simply. Waya laid a hand on the dress, not to take it, but to feel the weight he'd been carrying. That night, rain fell in heavy sheets. Waya came in soaked, a sack of wild mint in her arms, her dress clinging to her legs. She hung it near the fire to dry. Dripping, delicate, worn but still lovely. Mark stared at it for a long time, then reached for it. And stopped. His hand hovered, hesitant. You can touch it, Waya whispered behind him. But not with fear. He looked back. Her eyes didn't flinch. He turned and sat beside her. The fire cast long shadows, flickering over wood and wool and skin. Thunder cracked in the distance. She leaned her head against his shoulder, slowly, softly. He didn't move away. They sat like that, listening to the rain. No kiss. No confession. No rush. Just a moment of warmth held gently between them, like something too fragile to speak of yet. And still, it was real. The letter came folded twice, tucked under a saddle blanket at the general store. Mark didn't ask how they found him. Word traveled on its own in the mountains, through wind, wagon tracks, and mouths too used to silence. He read it once. Then, saddled his horse. The ride into town took a full day. The sun beat low on his back, the mountains shrinking behind him like retreating gods. His rifle hung over the saddle horn, not for show, but for memory. Dust clung to his boots. Pine needles clung to his coat. The courthouse. 3 men waited. Land barons in polished vests and stiff smiles, each claiming ownership of the valley Mark called home. One pointed toward a map, where the cabin sat like a speck under a larger claim. Another mentioned trespassers, meaning Waya and Nia. The sheriff didn't speak, but he leaned just enough toward Mark to let him know. Trouble was coming, and it wouldn't wait long. Mark stepped forward. His voice was not loud, but it carried. I'm claiming that land under the Homestead Act, he said, slow, like every word was carved from stone. Not for me, for my wife and child. The room stilled. That he pulled out the paper, signed and sealed in black ink. They carry my name, he said, looking no one directly in the eye. And my land carries their feet. The sheriff folded his arms. One man scoffed, but no one challenged Mark's record was still carved into the memories of men older than their uniforms. The cabin had stood on that land for 15 years. His hands had built it. His sweat had fed the earth. And now, so had his love. No law could argue with that. When he returned, the sky was turning gold behind the peaks. His saddlebags held a marriage license, 2 pieces of hard candy, and a red ribbon that he'd bought for a penny and a promise. The cabin door creaked open before he could knock. Waya stood there. No shawl, no shoes, hair unbraided and wild from the breeze. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't look for proof. She just reached for his hand and led him inside. Nia came barreling from the back room, squealing at the candy before even noticing the ribbon. She wrapped herself around Mark's leg like a vine. He chuckled and lifted her up, letting her sit on his shoulder, laughing at the height. By the fire, 2 dresses now hung side by side. One pale, old, delicate. The other stitched from scraps. Deer hide, cotton, and stubborn beauty. Waya had made it. The kettle began to hiss. A rocking chair creaked gently in rhythm. The scent of mint and ash filled the room. Mark sat in silence. The girl braided his beard as Waya leaned into him. Outside, the land breathed, free, untouched, still theirs. Inside, something lasting took root. Some men plant crops, some plant legacies, and some, without meaning to, plant families.